It's a warm summer afternoon in 1914. In a quiet city, Sarajevo, a single shot rings out, an assassination that will change the course of history forever. One man, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, lies dead. His death, it's the catalyst for the bloodiest conflict the world has ever seen. But here's the thing, nobody expected it. No one thought that a single act of violence, carried out by a single person, would lead to a global war that would leave 16 million dead and forever alter the course of nations. The question is, how did we go from one moment of shock to a world engulfed in flames? And what can we learn from the events that followed, where Europe, once the epicenter of art, culture, and philosophy, was transformed into a war zone? This wasn't just any war. It wasn't just armies clashing on some distant battlefield. No, this was a war that reached into every corner of society, where men, women, and children alike were affected. It was a war fought with new weapons and new strategies, where humanity was pushed to its limits and beyond. But even more terrifying, it was a war that nobody wanted but everyone got dragged into. How did we get here? Let's start with the spark, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914. This single moment, so seemingly insignificant at the time, set off a deadly chain of events. But that's the first thing you need to understand about World War I. The world was already on edge. All it took was one small incident to ignite a fire that would spread out of control. Austria-Hungary, already suspicious of Serbia's growing power and nationalist movements, immediately placed the blame on Serbia for the murder. They didn't hesitate. On July 28, 1914, just 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. And that, my friends, was the first domino. What happened next was a series of reactions that would drag every major power in Europe into the conflict. But let me take you deeper. The real question is, why did these nations go to war so quickly? Why did this assassination, tragic as it was, lead to a global catastrophe? Was the world simply waiting for the right moment to explode? Or were there larger forces at play that set everything in motion long before the gunshot was heard in Sarajevo? You see, it wasn't just about the assassination. Behind the scenes, Europe had been quietly building toward a war for decades. The seeds of conflict had been sown much earlier in the 19th century, and by 1914, all the pieces were in place. Europe had become a tinderbox, waiting for a spark. Militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, each one was a fuse, and the Archduke's assassination was the match. Let's explore how these forces came together to create the perfect storm. Let's rewind the clock. Europe before 1914, a place brimming with power, ambition, and distrust. Nations had been competing with one another for supremacy for years. It wasn't just about fighting for territory, it was about securing influence, preserving empires, and establishing global dominance. First, there was militarism. Think about it, what happens when countries start to treat war like it's inevitable? When every major nation is pouring money into military expansion, building bigger and better weapons, and making secret plans for defense. The result is that all these countries are just waiting for an excuse to fight. Germany, Britain, and France were all locked in an arms race. The bigger the army, the better the chance of winning, or so they thought. What they didn't realize was that by focusing so much on their military might, they were actually setting the stage for an explosion of violence. But militarism wasn't the only problem. It was compounded by the system of alliances that had been carefully built over decades. The idea was simple. If one country was attacked, their allies would rush to their defense. What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed the Triple Alliance. On the other side, France, Russia, and Britain created the Triple Entente. These alliances were meant to deter war, but instead, they acted as traps. When war broke out, all these nations were bound to support each other, no matter how much they might have wished they didn't have to. Then came nationalism. National pride was so strong that it became a driving force for entire countries. This was especially true for Serbia, where many believed they had to protect their right to self-determination at all costs. Austria-Hungary saw this as a direct threat to its empire, and when a Serbian nationalist assassinated the Archduke in June 1914, they saw it as the perfect excuse to crush Serbia once and for all. What they didn't see coming was how this decision would lead to a much larger conflict. The entire continent was already poised for war. All it took was one match to light it up. The countdown to war had begun. It started small, but once the bomb exploded, there was no going back. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, confident that this would be a short and decisive battle. But things weren't as simple as they thought. Russia, an ally of Serbia, began mobilizing its army. And just like that, Germany, standing by Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia on August 1, 1914. The alliances were triggered, and before anyone could stop it, the entire continent was heading toward war. But it didn't end there. France was pulled in due to its alliance with Russia, and Britain declared war on Germany after Germany invaded Belgium on August 4, 1914. What started with one nation's decision quickly turned into a domino effect. One country after another joined the fight. Within weeks, Europe was in flames. The world was at war. At first, they thought it would be quick. Just a few months, and everything would be over. But no one anticipated the scale of the destruction. No one had prepared for the scale of human loss. As the weeks passed, the war dragged on. The initial enthusiasm quickly turned into horror. What had been meant to be a short, decisive war became something far more terrifying, a war of attrition, where the lines between victory and defeat blurred and millions of lives were lost. The Western Front was a maze of trenches, stretching across France and Belgium. Soldiers fought for years in the dirt and mud, facing constant artillery bombardments, gas attacks, and sniper fire. The Battle of the Somme, starting on July 1, 1916, would become one of the most brutal battles of the war. Over 1 million men would fall by the time it ended on November 18, 1916, with little territorial gain. On the Eastern Front, Russia, despite its vast landmass, was at a disadvantage. Poorly equipped, it struggled to hold back Germany and Austria-Hungary. The battles here were just as brutal, but unlike the static trench warfare of the West, the Eastern Front saw more movement. The Russians suffered heavy losses, and by 1917, the Russian Empire was on the brink of collapse. The Italian front was marked by mountainous terrain and fierce fighting between Italy and Austria-Hungary. Italy, initially part of the Triple Alliance, switched sides in 1915 to join the Allies. The Italian army faced severe losses in the brutal battles of Isonzo, but they eventually managed to push the Austro-Hungarians back after the Battle of Vittorio Veneto in 1918. In 1915, the Allies launched an attack on the Ottoman Empire, hoping to secure a vital supply route to Russia. The Gallipoli campaign ended in disaster. Despite landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula, the Allies failed to capture the Dardanelles, leading to heavy casualties. This campaign highlighted the challenges of fighting in unfamiliar and hostile terrain. In the Middle East, the war took on a different character. The Arab Revolt, led by T. E. Lawrence of Arabia, saw the Arabs fighting against the Ottoman Empire in a bid for independence. The British and their Arab allies launched a series of attacks, eventually capturing Jerusalem in 1917 and weakening the Ottoman hold on the region. The war wasn't confined to Europe. In Africa, European powers clashed over their colonial territories. The British and the Germans fought in East Africa, with the famous German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck leading a guerrilla campaign that tied up thousands of British troops. Meanwhile, in West Africa, colonial troops were called upon to fight, expanding the war beyond Europe. In the Pacific, Japan, aligned with the Allies, took advantage of Germany's preoccupation with the Western Front and seized German-controlled territories in China and the Pacific. Japan's navy had a significant presence in the Pacific, disrupting German shipping routes. Their involvement expanded the war to the Asia-Pacific region, creating a more global scale. The Arctic front witnessed intense naval battles in the North Sea, where British and German fleets fought for control of critical shipping lanes. One of the most famous engagements was the Battle of Jutland in 1916. While the British won tactically, the Germans managed to keep their fleet intact, prolonging the naval conflict. This wasn't just a war for soldiers. World War I was a war that touched every life, everywhere. Entire cities were bombed, families were torn apart, and entire generations of men disappeared. Civilians became the unseen victims of this conflict. Imagine a city like London or Paris, busy, vibrant places, suddenly turned into war zones. Air raids, artillery shelling, and the constant fear of attack became a normal part of life. Food was scarce, supplies were rationed, and every day was a struggle for survival. But here's the twist: while men were fighting on the front lines, women stepped in. They took over factories, hospitals, farms. They became the backbone of their countries, doing jobs that had once been considered men's work. The war shifted social structures, and when it was over, the world would never be the same. Women would never go back to the old ways. After 4 years of unrelenting war, the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918. The world exhaled, but the peace they hoped for, it was more like a time bomb ticking quietly in the background. On June 28, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. The world's leaders hoped this would bring peace, but they couldn't have known just how harsh the treaty would be. Germany was blamed for the entire war, forced to pay crippling reparations, give up territories, and disarm completely. Humiliated and weakened, Germany was left with bitterness, and that bitterness would grow into something much darker in the years to come. This peace wasn't really peace at all. It was a temporary ceasefire, and it planted the seeds for an even worse conflict just 2 decades later. The war didn't just change borders, it changed everything. The Russian, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and German empires fell apart. New nations emerged, and the world order was upended. But beyond the politics, something more profound happened. The war marked the end of an era, a shift in how we viewed ourselves, our societies, and our futures. The war sparked new technologies, tanks, airplanes, and even the first use of chemical weapons. But for all the technological advances, the human cost was immeasurable. Millions died, and the psychological scars remained long after the final battle. And what had it all been for? Land, power, national pride. In the end, it was the people who paid the price. World War I is a powerful reminder of how fragile peace can be. A single moment, a single decision, can send the world spiraling into chaos. But it also teaches us that the cost of war is far too great. It's a lesson we must never forget. Because history has a way of repeating itself. And the scars of this war, though faded, are still felt today. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe the channel.